finally our little rumor round is now over. Und ich bitte die Studierenden, ask the students for questions. Who wants to go first? And you can, ask in any language you want.
Spanish, French, German, Swiss German, whatever.
English.
Yeah.
Latin.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? Also, of course, the people in the Zoom may ask questions.
Erstmal danke für Ihren Vortrag. Ihre Erwähnung von den Erfahrungen der Franzosen in Louisiana und der Briten in Jamestown hat mich so ein bisschen auf den Gedanken gebracht, gibt es ähnliche, Observationen auch bei den Niederländern im Bereich Fernasien oder gibt es irgendwie so einen historischen Punkt, ab dem dieses Narrativ mehr oder minder verschwindet oder man sich wissenstechnisch quasi mehr auf diese wissenschaftlich so weit entwickelt hat, dass man gesagt hat, dass oder diese klimatischen Faktoren durchaus bewusster wurden bei der Erklärung?
Danke. Das ist eine super spannende Frage, die ich super gerne ins Projekt aufnehmen würde. Leider das gehört nicht zu meinen Sprachen, kann ich kein Niederländisch. Deswegen untersuche ich das jetzt noch nicht. Wer weiß, vielleicht irgendwann in meinem Leben kommt es noch. Oder ich suche mir niederländische Kollaborateure. Das wäre total spannend zu sehen, ob sich das auch in die niederländische Situation mit reinzieht. Und ob es auch, also das weiß ich wirklich nicht, ob es auch in Asien sozusagen dieser Topos weiter sozusagen genutzt wird am Anfang. Ich weiß nicht, Antje, weißt du es nicht? Ich glaube, die Situation ist auch anders. Ne?
Der Kontext ist so anders,
ja.
dass einfach diese Erzählung da nicht funktioniert.
Genau. Also das ist also ganz platt zu sagen, das hängt mit der jetzt muss man die richtigen Begriffe nutzen, in Anführungszeichen Zivilisiertheit der Gesellschaften zusammen, ja, also in europäischer Perspektive, auf die Europäer treffen. Würde ich sagen, in weiten Teilen. Das ist natürlich anders in den Amerikas, zumindest auch auf den Inseln. Die Europäer treffen ja dann auch die wieder in europäischen Termini Hochkulturen der Maya und der Azteken und da ist das Verhältnis dann auch wieder anders. Aber so, ich glaube, das spielt mal eine Rolle dafür, dass dieser Topos dann funktioniert. Sorry, was war nochmal der zweite Teil?
Ob es so einen gewissen, sag ich mal,
genau.
historischen Cut-off gibt, ab dann das nicht mehr wirklich so als Narrativ bedient wird. Ja,
und also ich würde sagen, das ist wahrscheinlich so wie auch in Europa dann irgendwann diese Topoi vom Kornjuden oder auch von den Bäckern sozusagen als Schuldige oder auch Hexen als Schuldige für solche Anlässe nicht mehr funktionieren. Das ist eine Richtung in den meisten Fällen 18. Jahrhundert, wo wir auch ganz anders, also wo man in den Quellen auch ganz andere Termini und Beschreibungen für diese klimatischen Phänomene hat. Also wo ganz anders gesprochen wird über und mehr in unseren heute gewohnten Termini, wenn man so möchte, als jetzt zu dieser frühen Phase, so am Wechsel von Hochmittelalter zu tun hat. Danke.
More questions? Fragen? Herr Schädler.
Ja. Vielen Dank. Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank für Ihren Vortrag. Was ich mich gefragt habe, wenn so diese Analogie hergestellt wird, Jamestown 100 Jahre später zu Hispaniola, wurden dann die bürgerliche Bevölkerung dort in den Amerikas eigentlich von den Europäern irgendwie als eine einheitliche Gruppe, irgendwie als eine gemeinsame kulturelle Gruppe gegeben, die diese Strategie dann die ihnen unterstellt wurde, irgendwie so verinnerlicht haben, weil jetzt so erstmal logisch hergedacht, können die sich nicht irgendwie abgesprochen haben. Also dass das irgendwie, wie das weitergegeben hätte werden können und dass das von daher irgendwie, ich sag mal, keine Ahnung, kulturell irgendwie habitualisiert ist, dass das eine Gruppe ist, die sich gegen Einflüsse von außen so wehrt. Und dann ist noch eine zweite Frage, wenn das auf die Gewalt von Kolumbus-Männern nach der ersten Expedition zurückgeführt wird in der europäischen Erklärung, ist das dann nicht auch irgendwie so ein Eingeständnis davon, dass das irgendwie Unrecht war und dass darauf eine Reaktion erfolgt? Also das unterstellt ja sozusagen auch eine gewisse Erkenntnis bei denen es angetan wurde. Also dass man sagt, das war Unrecht und deshalb dürfen die sich auch dafür wehren.
Danke. Auch für beide Fragen sind auch sehr wichtig und gleich dann viele Aspekte. Also diese vereinheitlichende Perspektive auf indigene Bevölkerung. Ich würde aus so wie wir es sehen und wie es mir sozusagen auch vorliegt in diesen zwei Perspektiven, also das eine halt wirklich aus diesen frühen Chroniken und dann sozusagen die Engländer, die das halt wiederholen und für die es logisch zu sein scheint, das ist hier halt so, ja, würde ich sagen, ja, das ist so. Also man hat hier, also vielleicht ist einem noch klar, dass irgendwie geografisch vielleicht ein bisschen unterschiedliche Regionen sind und da vielleicht auch kulturell unterschiedliche Bräuche herrschen, aber so weit hat man vielleicht noch nicht mal geguckt, sondern es ist einfach als Folie für die Erklärung von Schwierigkeiten am Anfang mit der Umwelt und weil eben nicht erklärbar ist und weil diese klimatischen Zyklen noch nicht erfahren worden sind, ja, und man halt auch noch nicht so drüber nachdenkt, wie wir heute. Es ist ganz schwierig, immer auch sozusagen über diese Phänomene zu sprechen, ohne gleichzeitig unser heutiges Wissen und unsere Termini damit rein zu projizieren, ja. Also, aber man muss sich das immer so vorstellen, die Menschen kommen da in eine Umgebung, die Engländer, für die ist das genauso eine Erstkontaktsituation wie für die Spanier. Für die Engländer ist es insofern etwas einfacher, eben als sie diese Chroniken lesen können und man dann eben schon weiß, Indigene machen das oder können zumindest irgendwie sowas tun, wie Nahrungsmittel verstecken. Und dann ist das wirklich diese Situation, dass man erstmal nur mit dem eigenen mitgebrachten Wissen, also dem eigenen indigenen Wissen, wenn man so möchte, dem europäischen indigenen Wissen, ja, also dem britischen oder dem spanischen, quasi dahin kommen und das erstmal dahin projizieren kann. Also das ist so ein bisschen das Ergebnis dessen, was ich aus auch meiner Forschung zu Französisch-Louisiana gesehen habe und jetzt eben aus diesen Aspekten auch eigentlich mitnehme. Und das kommt halt meistens nicht so richtig raus. Und dabei passieren eben viele so ungewollte Nebeneffekte und inklusive natürlich dann die Projektion, solche kulturellen Projektionen aus Europa auf Gesellschaften, die einfach auch nicht verstanden werden. Und dann die Gewalt und diese Frage ist das nicht eigentlich auch ein Schuldeingeständnis? Ja. Also das ist so, den Spaniern ist schon auch klar und das ist auch in diesem ganzen Anfangsdiskurs mit drin, vor allem angeregt natürlich durch das Casas, der diese Ungerechtigkeit gegenüber der indigenen Bevölkerung ganz klar verbalisiert, darüber schreibt und das aufbringt, wo es dann auch diese Debatte von Valladolid gibt, wo auch rechtlich sozusagen aus juristischer Sicht gefragt wird, wer darf hier eigentlich versklavt werden und wer nicht. Und das ist dann ein bisschen später im 16. Jahrhundert, Mitte 16. Jahrhundert diese Debatte. Aber schon auch zu diesem frühen Zeitpunkt ist das so unterschwellig schon auch natürlich bewusst und gewusst, dass man nicht so mit den Menschen, die man da antrifft, umgehen kann und will. Also auch wenn am Anfang dieser Kolonisierungssituation auch diese Frage auftaucht, man kennt diesen Kontinent nicht, man weiß nicht, was das für ein Volk ist, für eine Bevölkerung ist. Gehören die überhaupt zu den biblischen Völkern Noahs? Ne? Also, oder sind das Menschen in Anführungszeichen in diesem christlichen Kontext? Und wenn ja, sind sie christianisierbar, etc. Das ist sozusagen so dieser ganze Komplex, der da im Hintergrund steht. Aber also ich lese das auch durchaus so als schon so halb irgendwo bewusstes, zumindest ist es berechtigt, wenn die jetzt irgendwie was gegen uns machen, als Rache, Schlag oder Feldzug. Ja.
Vielen Dank.
Ja, yes, please.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. The topic is so interesting. I would love to understand. Can you please sometimes switch to English if that's possible?
Mhm.
Also in the discussion, you mean that we...
When answering the questions?
Sure, okay.
So shall I
Answer questions in English.
briefly translate what was being said? Okay. So hang on. So did you understand his question? So okay. So his first question was on whether there was something like a sort of sort of blanking perspective on indigenous peoples was kind of at the background of the English perception, kind of produced out of that context of having the Spaniards creating that myth of the treacherous Indian and then transporting that into the Chesapeake Bay. I would, in a very sort of abbreviated answer, I would say yes, that's the case. So they're like the indigenous population is like a foil that the Europeans project a lot on, and obviously in these first contact situations, they didn't have an opportunity also, even if they had wanted to, or the inclination to study, like, who are we going to interact with, which obviously they didn't do just out of their whole kind of setup and cultural background and religious background. Even if they had wanted to do that, they wouldn't have been able to. So it's just this meeting, and then it's clear it's this kind of us and them situation. And once you have accounts, like the English do of the Spanish, you have that sort of narrative that you can use. Right. And the other question was whether there wasn't an implicit kind of understanding of culpability in that context of violence of the Spaniards towards the indigenous population, and sort of wasn't that kind of clear in a certain sense to the Spaniards? And I would say yes, there is a certain underlying knowledge of yes, it wasn't like that was obviously not right. What the people of the first voyage of Columbus's men did. I mean, regardless of indigenous population or not, this is not how you behave. And in that sense, sort of, it would be understandable at least that the indigenous population would revenge themselves. So, and I would say yes, that is understandable.
And thank you for asking to switching back to English. We'll try to sort of do the translation.
Oh yeah, I just realised that it's kind of late and I have difficulties finding words and translations.
No worries. I will open the floor for questions from anyone now, and I have one by Manuel Pan.
Thank you so much for your talk. I don't really have a question, but maybe only another remark for point C. Well, you had point A and B, and
we have another scenario.
Yes, and
good one. Okay.
And another scenario could be, or maybe there's the possibility of war encounters with other tribes in the Caribbean. I'm asking, or I'm mentioning that because in the last 2 years there have been discussions about Carib Indians emerging into the north, way much more into the north of the Antilles. And so there might have been a scenario that the Caribs came to the Arawaks and there were war encounters. What do you think about that?
War encounters?
Yeah.
And how would that sort of? So I'm not catching the sort of the hypotheses, or what? How would the encounter of Caribs and Arawaks, or war encounters of Arawaks? Kind of
that fields were destroyed and
okay,
and that they took
okay, so that would be a precondition as well in a certain sense, that the Spaniards didn't understand or see, or were unable to. You're right. Okay.
Or maybe they. I don't know. I think the logbook is lost, right? It was written by Las Casas.
Columbus' original logbook was lost, but Las Casas had copies.
Well, maybe it didn't catch it.
Huh?
Maybe it didn't catch it.
Possible. Yeah, I mean, I would be interested to see the research on these sort of peoples on the Caribs. If you can give me the titles, it's an interesting idea. But I would say, the Spaniards would probably not be able to differentiate between Caribs and Arawaks, obviously, yes. But then I might expect more, at least descriptions of some kind of violent situations or sceneries that they would have probably met. So they may have seen, I don't know, people lying around dead, or destroyed houses, or I think Europeans would have been able to observe that. They would have been able to observe a war scenery, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And that's not in these descriptions. These descriptions are invariably, it's beautiful and paradisiac, and obviously this is something to question as well, because these accounts are being used to get more money off the crown, to have more explorations going on, etc. But still, I would say if something as disruptive as a war scenery had been seen, it would probably have been accounted for. But it's an interesting point. So I'm gonna make a note of that and shall have these titles of.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I believe, I cannot say for certain, but I believe that there's one mention where the peaceful Arawaks are compared to the warring tribes of the Karens, right?
Yeah.
So that might be some kind of clue to this encounter.
That's later on, and also obviously an observation, a very early observation by Columbus is that the Arawak are sort of timid and cowardly and naked as God made them, and all of these kind of tropes that we also know. But then compared to the more sort of bellicose Caribs, once they experience these, so they have an experience of different tribes in the Caribbean, yes. And exactly because of that, I would still surmise that if there was previous conflict and war between them visible or visibly, kind of, that it would have been accounted for somehow in the chronicles. I can't be wrong.
Thank you so much for your talk. Two questions about the explanation of this topic. And the first is, were there any religious explanations, like lost legitimation for the endeavor in the Americas, especially for the Spaniards to go to the Americas and do such things with the Indians? And the second is, in this time we have common knowledge from antiquity about certain world regions and the climate, and ideas from Aristotle, for example. Did these narratives play any role before Columbus' second travel starts?
So the motive for even kind of venturing out to across the Atlantic is very much an economic one at the beginning, because during the 15th century, especially with the fall of Constantinople, the trade routes of the Europeans to the riches of the Orient are being closed off. So you probably know, many of you know, that's the common story of why did Columbus even venture out over the Atlantic. So in search for India and gold, spices, silver, and also enslavable peoples, because that's what the Spanish see the Portuguese do on the African coast. They venture out across the Atlantic. So this is very much an economic endeavor first. The missionary sort of argument comes on top of that, also sort of in order for this whole venture to sort of happen in a Christian manner, even if we know that it didn't, very much so. And but so the religious discourse and the missionizing discourse and issues that come sort of later and almost in a sort of secondary stance. Aristotelian geography before venturing out, definitely. There's a very interesting book by Nicholas Way Gomez that actually talks about the American tropics and this notion of Columbus not only sailing west, but also slightly to the south, with kind of the tropics in mind, again in comparison with what the Portuguese do on the African coast, and sort of realizing that and we're talking about the Aristotelian tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, the knowledge and that there are riches to be had, and the idea of maybe on the same sort of latitude in a different place we could get similar riches and enslavement. So yes, definitely there is this is going on. That's not my own research, but it's a very weighty, big book, but very interesting. I recommend if you're interested in this to read.
Thank you. Peter Schuster.
Mir ist ein Argument noch nicht ganz plausibel, und zwar, dass die hohen Opferzahlen durch Gewalt und Krankheiten dazu geführt haben sollten, dass die Menschen schlechter versorgt sind. Eigentlich ist es ja umgekehrt, dass bei rückgängigen Bevölkerungszahlen eigentlich die Bepflanzung in die besten Böden geht, also eigentlich pro Kopf die Ernte besser sein wird und die Versorgungslage besser sein wird. Also wie muss ich das verstehen? Das ist so ähnlich wie ich kann das noch ergänzen, das ist so ähnlich wie die Wüstungen im späten Mittelalter als Krisenphänomen gedeutet wurden. Das sind sie überhaupt nicht, sondern man hat, weil es weniger Leute gab, Orte aufgegeben, die eben schlechtere Böden hatten. Ja, man zieht sich dann auf die fruchtbareren Gebiete zurück und müsste demnach pro Kopf einen höheren Ernteertrag haben.
Yeah.
So the question is, basically, what kind of influence does a receding population actually have on the supply of food? Shouldn't it be rather that there's more food when there's less people? So this is very abbreviated, but maybe that's sort of the core of the question.
Is it okay if I answer in English? So I don't have.
It's okay.
Very interesting question. I must say I have taken this point with very few questions from the research. I think it's at least what you can read about the whole great dying subject in the Americas. So the Europeans arrive, and in particular, there is still a discussion whether it's mainly pathogens that deplete the indigenous society so quickly, or violence. It's obviously kind of both. And I would say that the rapidity with which this happens, so it's only a few decades, and especially in the Caribbean, where you have these island situations. So you have a territorially limited situation with, I think it's still difficult also to assess. We don't have exact or even near to exact population numbers. That's another huge issue with how many people actually lived on this island, the other islands, and then also in the Americas per se. Huge debate, and figures vary wildly. Yeah. But it's what everybody sort of agrees on is that there is a very steep decline, almost to 90%, of indigenous population in the first century, more or less, the first 50 years of European arrival, which then is argued that this situation created such a disruption of society and knowledge base as well, that fields were overgrown, crops weren't planted anymore. So I thought, to me, that sounded plausible, but maybe because I don't know your examples from medieval Europe, I would be interested to have more in-depth knowledge and read maybe of these in order to be able to sort of argue for also societal differences. But it's kind of difficult to do because the pre-Columbian situation in the Americas is so at debate. Yeah, I mean, we don't have the same knowledge and sort of specificity of knowledge of what kind of land use, number of people, ways of planting crops, etc. It's all kind of a bit in flux. Let's call it that. the historical knowledge is not as clear as for Europe, and I think it's difficult to make that comparison. But I find it's interesting, and what I would also say might be informative is to look at what happens after large-scale plague outbreaks. So after the Black Death in the 14th century, do we have a sort of breakdown of? No, we have flowering.
Breakdown of population, but
of population, but not of
economic crisis.
Production. Yeah, and I mean that's what I know, and I don't know a lot about the situation. Is that there is more land and people actually get wealthier in a certain sense, yeah, and they profit from the situation. Well, yeah, in the Americas that's not the case, as far as I know. Yeah.
Thanks.
First, thank you. It was very interesting. Why did you choose Las Casas, etc., but not Chanca? I read a source from him.
That's the doctor.
The doctor.
Yes, the medic. Exactly. I'm actually not sure anymore whether he also has a passage on this indigenous ploy. Does he?
Yeah, about encounter with a Taino and how they built a house, and was I thought it was something about uncertainty situation. So it's interesting. Yeah.
I shall relook at it.
And he has written something about the climate with hurricanes, I think.
Yeah. So hurricane observations are sort of there, not unusual.
I don't know, but
so that's that's why I was able to also kind of show you those quotes by D'Anghiera and Oviedo, because it's such a large scale phenomenon that the Spaniards experienced. They didn't exactly know what it was, but they could describe it as a storm, obviously. So this is not that they are kind of easy, okay, easy climatic phenomena. The more difficult sort of phenomena I was trying to get at, is can Spaniards at that early point in time actually pinpoint, oh, there is a drought going on. If you come to a place that you don't know, could you see drought? Would you know sort of, we today would probably say, yes, of course I can see a dried out tree, right? And you could sort of make a difference between a dried out tree and a flowering one. But still, sort of I just don't have these kinds of descriptions in the sources. Hurricane or storm or winds, as you've seen also from the quotes I used, are things that Europeans also observe. And I used the three chroniclers because they're very, they all share this narrative of the treacherous Indian, almost in the same words, kind of. But I'm happy to re-look at Chanca if you think that you could have more. At the time when I was looking at these sources, I sort of put him aside for the moment. But thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for this brilliant talk. And I was very that you offer us an almost natural science explanation for indigenous people not being linked to conspiracies and something like that, if climate change and weather works the way you showed us. However, I have one question concerning the uncertainty thing, so to speak. If it is linked with uncomparability, what you just suggested, so what can they not compare? First of all, we have like almost 50 years of discovery by the Portuguese in different lands, of course, but not it's not something new that you discover something new, so to speak. Yeah. And on the other hand, famine is something which people are not familiar with on an everyday basis, but famines occur. and you have to give explanation to that. And you mentioned, the witch explanation or the baker explanation, and this is linked. The explanation given here is a refinement of these two explanations, as you said. So my question is, where could we pin down, and don't question that there is uncertainty, where could we pin down precisely where the uncertainty comes from if you have already narratives and modes or possibilities to compare the situation given in the Caribbean?
Thank you for that question as well. I would just say if the case of the Portuguese had been informative for the Spaniards, they would have used it.
Okay.
I'm guessing. Maybe I'm wrong. But as the English use the Spaniards 100 years later, in a certain sense of, it's a kind of like, and obviously maybe there is a difference with regard to the power situation at that point in time. So Spain is the empire, and the English are still looking up to the empire. And maybe so it's okay to sort of say like, oh, we're having the same experience as the Spanish do, and implicitly sort of saying we're on the same way to becoming a great empire as the Spanish. Whereas for the Spanish, there may have been too much competition in order to compare themselves with the Portuguese. So I'm just trying to make up reasons why the Spanish would not have used Portuguese experience as a sort of comparative foil, but that could be one option. The other is just that they're not. I mean, they're really sort of sailing away into the unknown, and I mean, they also know that. They kind of guess, right? We're like, if we go around the globe, we will find India too. Look, we could sort of sail along the African coast and do what is already known, sort of, but we're not. We can't, because there are treaties and papal bulls that actually forbid the Spanish to sail past a certain line. Yeah. I don't remember exactly which one it was. Bad, but yes. So in this whole kind of competition with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese claiming the West African coast as their territory or for themselves to explore, there is sort of a fight of papal bulls. So the Portuguese appeal to the Pope, claiming like that this is their territory. The Spanish may not come anywhere closer to below the Azores, I think it was the geographical line. And so that was also belonged to the push or the pressure for the Spanish to actually venture out across the Atlantic to the west. And so that is the first large-scale unknown and uncertainty, because they didn't know how far that circumference really was, that they were guessing that they had to sail along, and then the Americas happened. That, nobody kind of knew or was guessing. That's why they thought, okay, now we're in India. And so that is high uncertainty, number one, and then kind of arriving in a place that, okay, from according to Aristotelian geography, it's in the torrid zone, so it could be deadly, but you already know through the Portuguese experience that it's probably not. You have this expectation in many ways of what you are going to encounter in that region. So in that sense, there may not be that much uncertainty, but at the same time, there kind of is, because the realities are different. The people that you meet are white-skinned and not dark-skinned, as the Portuguese have encountered, etc. So there are all of these issues, and yeah. So, but I could be wrong. But my perception would be one of high uncertainty, and then the mechanism to kind of deal with that uncertainty is to make things familiar through comparison. So we compare with Castilla a lot. So this is what you can also read in Columbus's sources. And we come with that European foil that we sort of project on the indigenous population in the sort of tradition of the corn Jew and the merchant or the baker, etc. So yeah, but that's my hypothesis. If you don't think it's plausible, I'm happy to discuss more with you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Antje, please.
This is a question following up for your answer. I'm wondering, in this paper, you really talked about the first years. Yeah. So is there really uncertainty? Because you know so much. I mean, what I mean is you knew so much about India. You had so many Italian merchants there. Yeah, you had lots of things you knew about India. I always thought the uncertainty started in the moment when they understood they are not in India. But the first years, I thought that they, a long time, felt at home in a certainty before this was destroyed.
Yeah, yes, good point. But also, I wonder, is that so? I mean, also from those early chronicles, I actually wondered whether that notion we have now that, oh, Columbus thought he was in India, whether that's actually so true. But maybe yes, but from some, and also from these later chronicles, and obviously they were written with more distance and probably with the knowledge already that, it wasn't India.
You know, when did that start? I mean, I know it came quite soon, yeah, but how long did at least Columbus? I thought that at the beginning, quite a time, he insisted it is India.
It's India, yeah. I think, that must have been at least the first 3 or 4 decades, but I don't have a sort of a firm date.
Thank you.
But yeah, thanks. It's another thing to think about.
Thank you so much. I have one follow-up question to that last discussion on uncertainty, obviously.
Yes, I was waiting for that.
Because what I found really convincing in your arguments is that what we see there, what we could maybe try to see, is what we call modes of navigating uncertainty. So there's a situation where I have maybe more or less uncertainty, but there's something that I have to kind of understand and maybe also put into context. So what they do is they use narratives. And I think that's very plausible, of course. I mean, we still do today, and I also like...
Quite human.
Yeah, and I also liked your hint at what the Spaniards did is something that we as historians maybe do today, also sort of use what we know is sort of the dominant narrative to deal with our own uncertainty. And then it's difficult to kind of get behind that dominant narrative to actually look at, okay, but I also have knowledge about climate, for example, and how does that actually figure into, or does that change the kinds of narratives that we are used to deal with?
Does it change the story?
So I really like that because it has these double layer of modes of dealing or modes of navigating uncertainty by the contemporaries in that particular situation, but also sort of the other side of the story when we look at how historians actually deal with their own uncertainty or what they actually have. Because I think what we can also see in your argument is what I wanted to ask is, what are they uncertain about? I mean, this is kind of the questions that Franz and Antje already had, because from their narratives, we could read that they are uncertain about all kinds of natural conditions. Still, I mean, even the European, the witchcraft narrative is also kind of a narrative that deals with the uncertainty that I really don't understand what's happening.
Exactly, yeah.
So is that a comparable mode of navigating the uncertainty of natural situations that I really don't know? And is that actually, would they be uncertain about the same things if they'd stayed in Europe? Does that make sense? I mean, this is, how does the particular Caribbean situation and being in a climate that I really don't understand, is that actually a factor if I already don't understand Europe in a sort of climate universe, climate narrative?
So, I mean, at first, I think it's important that with the Europeans moving to unfamiliar, new territories, environments, they transport their cultural baggage with them, and that perspective of the Christian cosmos and that God is in charge of nature and blows the wind and does all of these things. Or then, on the other hand, we have witches from like the devil's work sort of on the other side, right? And in particular, a society, and I think so. I perceive, and I would tie it to this switch or this ambiguity of using that trope in the chronicles. That sounds very plausible and certain, and at the same time, then in later passages, sort of still describing what we would call natural events, or winds and hurricanes, and then sort of how the sickness and the fatigue, elements that we wouldn't connect with that trope. So we have something like two narratives or two observations. One seems to be sort of the cultural sort of, okay, it's that, and the other a sort of a more just a different explanation or observation, and this coexistence of these two sort of observations or narratives, to me, shows, or I interpret that as an uncertainty. Maybe that's wrong, but I would say that's not unique to the Caribbean. So obviously these wrath of God ideas and then also natural observations also exist for Europe and European environments. But the difference, and this is what I'm implying, between those two is that in Europe, obviously, societies have been doing agriculture for centuries in the same place, and they know their cycles. They know the weather phenomena, etc., etc., and that's the huge difference to that place. And so there is this interpretive gap of what is happening here and what kinds of plants even grow here. They bring their wheat with them. They bring wine and oil with them to the island and live on those provisions until these provisions run out, and then they kind of come up to the indigenous population and kind of want to take their food. That's the second step, as I described. And so, but they don't even know whether the European crops will grow in the Caribbean. So, and they only realize after a while, well, wheat doesn't grow in the tropics really well, and wine neither, and olive trees also difficult. So so we have this whole cultural problem of Christian mass, wine, oil, bread. That doesn't work in this environment. So all of these issues, I mean, obviously that's not something they realize already in 1494, but that comes later. And so I would say this is, and you have to kind of read between the lines in a certain way. And now you can also, of course, we can say like, you're interpreting this into the society or into the situation, and that wasn't the case. But yeah, I mean, we don't have so many sources, and we have to hypothesize. And I'm saying this is a super micro study and something that sort of came up during research. I'm throwing it into the field, so to say, with a lot of uncertainty, as you've realized, on all sides, not just on the historical side, also on the natural scientific evidence. That is kind of what would help my argument if I had better paleoclimatic evidence. I do have a little, but again, very uncertain in many ways. But so for climate historical questions, that would be sort of at least one stepping stone to stand on, to say, okay, but the natural archives really point to this mega drought, so like in Blanton's case, where you can really sort of see the issue, like a 10-year drought that makes very evident that you couldn't plant anything and there would be a famine. I don't have that.
So I have one mini point, and then Franz also wants to sort of follow up with a small question or ask another question. Would you agree that then the scenario that you're describing could also be described as the narratives as a mode of navigating uncertainty? So I kind of put this all in the boxes that kind of my narrative fits. Then kind of produces new uncertainty because of the new environment where I cannot sort of build on the practical knowledge of agriculture that would sort of follow in my narrative. So there's a certain situation where the narrative breaks because of the wheat is not growing, or my food is gone and I don't know kind of how to go beyond the narrative because it's such a new situation. And then that way, I would argue that the mode of navigating being a narrative actually produces a situation in which uncertainty kind of grows rather than managing it. But that's just something to think about maybe over dinner. So fun.
Well, running the risk to annoy everyone because this is a follow-up, and I would like to pick on what you just said and your suggestion to read between the lines. Wouldn't it be fair to say that uncertainty is not that big, at least, if we have a number of narratives we can draw on to explain certain things, even plagues, or as soon as you have a witch in the cupboard, you can pull out if there is a plague. It is still uncertain whether you die or not, but still you have an explanation. So we can agree on that. But the question then would be, does the text itself show some uncertainty in terms of, I give you here this narrative everybody else would give in this situation, but I myself, me as a text, I'm not really convinced of this narrative, which shifts away from the idea that you as you said, you land, your ship arrives on a shore which you presume is India, and you know everything about India almost. So there's not you think, or whether you are irritated because, well, is this really India or something? How do we know that? If we read between the lines, it was your suggestion, and if we try to navigate uncertainties, I think the main point would be to find a text which gives us all these narratives and then at the same time says, well, I'm the text. I'm not convinced of the narratives I give you. But the text you showed, I think they kind of invented a new bakery, a new witch, so to speak, a new baker with the indigenous people, and it comes along quite convincing in a way, because these indigenous people are foreign, and we all know that foreigners do evil.
They're heathens. They're not Christians.
They're not Christians, and foreigners always do evil things. We know that.
Yeah, it would be wonderful to have that source. Unfortunately, I haven't discovered it yet. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say, but then maybe that's overstating the significance of that sort of double narrative that I just mentioned. So to have that explanation of the treacherous Indian on the one side, and then the description of natural phenomena might go in that direction, but I think I would overstretch that one if I said that's what you mean, because it's not. I mean, I think that's we would just overdo it. So there remains a lot of unresolved issues. As I said, it's a food for thought kind of hypothesis, and I'm not sure whether it's actually sort of properly resolvable. I mean, one thing is I would like to, and may still get there, to talk to the paleoclimatic colleagues and see whether they have, in the meantime, done more research, or whether I can find more papers that do research, more particular research on the islands during that time. So where I can sort of increase that evidence, and on the other hand, as I said, I'm not sure I can uncover more written sources, because obviously these would be the best evidence. As I said, I mean, it's always helpful to have climatic evidence, but there's nothing better than having a chronicle that gives you a date for an event, because we don't have years in tree rings, we don't have years in lake sediments, etc. So that's always kind of a bit of an issue there. But I take these points as food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.